Anushka stared at the flickering candlelight, her hand frozen midair as she held her pen over her journal. The once vibrant blue ink of her pen had dried at the tip, much like the love in her marriage. She had thought of this space, her journal, as her sanctuary, a place to pour her feelings. But tonight words betrayed her, staying lodged in her throat like unshed tears. Anushka. Ivan's voice thundered from the living room. Her heart sank. She knew that tone too well. The evening had been peaceful, perhaps too peaceful. She closed her journal with a soft sigh and walked toward the source of his anger. Ivan stood by the coffee table, his towering frame casting a shadow over a piece of paper in his hand. His face was a mask of disdain. "Care to explain this?" he growled, shaking the crumpled paper at her. It was a grocery receipt from the supermarket. Milk, bread, vegetables, nothing extravagant. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice cautious. "What's wrong?" Ivan mimicked her in mockery. "You spend my money like it grows on trees. Don't you think twice before you waste it on nonsense?" Anushka's fists clenched. "Milk and bread are not nonsense, Ivan. And this is for both of us. Don't play innocent," he snapped. "I know you're kind. You fooled me into this marriage, pretending to love me when all you wanted was my money." Anushka flinched, his words cutting deeper than the coldest winter night. "Is that really what you think of me after 3 years?" He laughed bitterly. "You think I don't know what your family is up to? They're just like you. Every call from your parents ends with you asking me for money. What am I, their aim?" She swallowed hard. It wasn't true, not entirely. Her parents had only asked for help a few times when they were struggling, but she knew Ivan would never understand. His family had old money, hers had none. "You're twisting the truth," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "I married you because I loved you, Ivan. You weren't this cruel before." "Cruel?" He stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "The only cruelty here is the scam you pulled on me. You're lucky I let you stay in this house." The room fell silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Anushka felt her chest tighten, suffocated by his words and the weight of her decision. "Maybe I shouldn't stay," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Ivan raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" She took a step back, her gaze meeting his. "I deserve better, Ivan. If you don't love me and never did, then this marriage is over. I'm not a prisoner and I won't let you treat me like one." His laughter was cold. "Where will you go? Back to your leeching family?" Anushka didn't respond. She turned and walked away, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence. In the bedroom, she sank onto the edge of the bed, her fingers trembling as she reached for her phone. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, but one stood out: freedom. For the first time in 3 years, Anushka realized the chains she wore weren't just from Ivan's cruelty. They were from her own fear of walking away. She dialed her sister's number, her voice steady as she said, "I need a place to stay." And with that, the first crack in the facade of her marriage widened, the foundation beginning to crumble. Anushka didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew one thing: she was done being Ivan's victim. Anushka lay on the bed, her mind drifting back to the beginning. Back when she thought love could conquer everything. The memory of how Ivan came into her life played like an old film, the colors faded but the emotions vivid. She had first seen him at a mutual friend's engagement party, 2 years before their own wedding. The room had been alive with chatter and laughter, guests clinking glasses and exchanging pleasantries. Amid the sea of smiling faces, Anushka's gaze had settled on a young man sitting in the corner. He was strikingly handsome, but there was a heaviness in his eyes, a loneliness that seemed to set him apart from the crowd. He wasn't mingling or laughing like the others. Instead, he stared at his glass of whiskey as though it held the answers to questions no one dared to ask. "Who's that?" she had asked her friend. "Oh, that's Ivan," her friend had replied. "He's been through a lot. Lost both his parents recently. He doesn't talk much." Something about him tugged at Anushka's heart. She couldn't explain it. Perhaps it was the way he seemed lost in a world of his own, or the quiet strength in his posture. She had wanted to approach him that night, to say something, anything, to ease the weight he seemed to carry. But she hadn't. Their paths crossed again months later when a distant relative proposed the idea of their marriage. Ivan was a man of status from an affluent family, and her family saw the union as a golden opportunity. Anushka had been hesitant at first, unsure if he even remembered her from that party. But when their families arranged a meeting and she sat across from him, her heart stirred again. He was quiet, reserved, and polite, answering questions mechanically. Yet when their eyes met, she thought she saw a flicker of something, pain perhaps, or maybe a longing to escape. She mistook it for depth, for a man who needed love to heal. When he proposed, it wasn't romantic. There were no grand gestures or heartfelt declarations. Instead, it was a simple statement over tea, his voice devoid of emotion. "Our families think this is a good match. I don't see why we shouldn't proceed." Anushka had convinced herself that his lack of enthusiasm was because of his grief. She told herself that with time her love would thaw the ice around his heart. She threw herself into the preparations with excitement, dreaming of the life they would build together. But the wedding day was the first of many disappointments. She remembered walking down the aisle, her heart pounding with joy and anticipation, only to meet Ivan's eyes, cold and distant. He looked like a man fulfilling an obligation, not someone starting a new chapter of his life. His vows were robotic, his hand limp in hers as they exchanged rings. There was no warmth in his gaze, no tenderness in his touch. Even their first dance felt like a duty he was forced to endure. Guests whispered about how composed and stoic the groom was, but Anushka knew better. She knew she had married a man whose heart wasn't hers to hold. From the first night it was clear. Ivan didn't consider her his wife. He kept a polite distance, speaking to her only when necessary and never letting her into his world. He tried everything, kindness, patience, understanding, but nothing broke through his walls. As she lay in the present, staring at the ceiling, Anushka felt the sting of her naivety. She had mistaken his sadness for depth, his aloofness for mystery. She had believed that love was enough to bridge the chasm between them, but love had never truly existed in their marriage. And now, 3 years later, she realized that Ivan hadn't just lost his parents. He had lost the ability to love. And she had lost herself trying to reach him. Ivan slammed the door behind him as he walked into the house. The sound echoed in the emptiness, but he didn't notice right away. He tossed his keys onto the table and loosened his tie, annoyed by the day's events. His mood darkened further when he realized the house was dark and silent. "Anushka," he called, his voice impatient. There was no reply. He flipped the light switch and the living room was illuminated, revealing the cold, sterile emptiness of the space. The usual aroma of spices from her cooking was absent. The dining table where a warm meal always awaited him was bare. His annoyance turned to confusion. He checked the kitchen, the bedroom, and even the bathroom. Nothing. It was as though Anushka had vanished. Ivan's brow furrowed. "She's bluffing," he muttered under his breath, remembering her parting words. He went back to the living room, sinking into the couch and pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his call log, searching for her number. He didn't usually call her. It had been years since he had last dialed her directly. Anything he needed was communicated through his secretary. That was how things worked between them. She was there to keep the house in order and fulfill her role, nothing more. But now his secretary wasn't useful. Ivan stared at the screen, her name glaring back at him. His pride urged him to put the phone down, to ignore her petty tantrum. But the silence around him pressed in, unfamiliar and unsettling. Finally, he pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before she answered. Her voice was calm, steady, and devoid of the usual nervousness she carried when speaking to him. "What do you want, Ivan?" The directness of her tone threw him off. He cleared his throat. "Where are you?" "That's none of your concern," she replied. "Don't be ridiculous, Anushka," he snapped. "Come back. You've made your point." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Made my point? Ivan, this isn't a game. I'm done being invisible in my own marriage." "Don't overreact," he said, his voice firm. "You have responsibilities here." There was a pause and then she said, "Responsibilities? You mean cooking your meals, cleaning your house, and being ignored like I'm a piece of furniture?" I've been doing that for 3 years, Ivan. And for what? To be treated like a stranger in my own home? Ivan clenched his jaw. You're being dramatic. Come back and we'll talk. No, Ivan. We won't, she said quietly. Because for the first time in years I'm choosing myself. I'm staying with someone who values me, who sees me. Don't call me again unless you figure out how to do the same. The line went dead. Ivan stared at his phone, her words ringing in his ears. She had never spoken to him like that before, with such certainty and finality. He looked around the empty house. For years, he had taken her presence for granted. The warmth of the lights she turned on before he got home, the meals she cooked without complaint, the way she tried to make their lifeless marriage bearable. For the first time, Ivan realized what he had lost. And for the first time he felt the weight of the emptiness he had created. Ivan paced the length of his office, his thoughts a tangled mess. It had been a week since Anushka left, and the silence at home was gnawing at him. He still told himself it was temporary, that she'd come to her senses and return. After all, where else could she go? But she hadn't called, hadn't texted. She hadn't even asked for money. That last part unsettled him the most. For years he had accused her of being a gold digger, of using him for his wealth, yet now she seemed content to walk away without a cent. His pride wouldn't let him admit it, but the thought of her absence stung. Not because he missed her, at least that's what he told himself, but because she had dared to leave. By the second week Ivan broke. He found himself dialing her number again. When she answered, her tone was calm and businesslike. What do you want, Ivan? We need to talk, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. There's nothing to talk about, she replied curtly. Anushka, stop this nonsense, he snapped. Come home and we'll sort this out. I'm not coming back, Ivan. Her words were final, unyielding. If you want to talk, it'll be through a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce. The word hit him like a slap. Divorce. Yes, Ivan. Divorce. I've wasted enough years on this sham of a marriage. Ivan's chest tightened. He had never considered divorce a possibility. Anushka leaving had been an inconvenience, something he thought would blow over. But divorce. That was permanent. You're being impulsive, he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. We can fix this. Anushka laughed bitterly. Fix this? Ivan, you've spent 3 years treating me like an outsider. You never loved me, never respected me, and now you think this can be fixed. I deserve better than this, better than you. Her words left him momentarily speechless. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. Had he been wrong? Was she really the villain he had painted her to be? Where are you staying? He asked, his tone softening further. That's none of your concern, she replied. I found a job, Ivan. I'm building a life for myself, one that doesn't revolve around your cold indifference. You should do the same. A job, he echoed, incredulous. He couldn't imagine her working. It didn't fit the image he had constructed of her. Yes, a job, she said firmly. I'm not your helpless little wife anymore. Before he could respond, she hung up. Ivan stared at his phone, her words ringing in his ears. Anushka, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair at her new workplace. A small marketing firm that had taken a chance on her despite her lack of experience. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. For the first time in years she felt a sense of purpose, a spark of independence. She thought of Ivan, of the years she had wasted trying to win his affection, and a wave of anger mixed with relief washed over her. She had lost so much of herself in that marriage, but now she was beginning to rebuild. Filing for divorce had been a difficult decision, but it was the right one. She was done being invisible, done being unloved. For Ivan, however, the realization was just beginning to dawn. As he sat alone in his silent house that evening, he found himself questioning everything he had assumed about Anushka, about their marriage, and about himself. And for the first time he wondered if it was too late to make things right. Ivan sat at his desk, the divorce papers spread out before him like an accusation. They had arrived earlier that day, delivered by a courier who barely looked him in the eye. His name was printed neatly at the top, next to hers, Anushka Patel. Seeing their names side by side like that felt surreal, as if the finality of it all was mocking him. He picked up the pen and held it over the signature line, his hand shaking slightly. Signing would mean admitting failure. Admitting that he had driven her away. For days he had replayed their last conversation in his mind, her voice sharp and unwavering as she declared her independence. The Ivan of 3 weeks ago would have brushed this off, convinced himself she would return eventually. But now, in the cold emptiness of his house, he couldn't deny the truth. He had underestimated her. The silence was unbearable. The absence of her presence, her quiet laughter, her attempts to draw him into conversation, the way she made their house feel like a home, gnawed at him. For the first time he allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had done. He thought of the early days, of the woman who had looked at him with hope and love in her eyes. She had been radiant at their wedding, a stark contrast to his cold, robotic demeanor. At the time he had justified his distance as self-preservation, convincing himself that love wasn't something he needed or deserved. Now he realized he had been a coward. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Ivan grabbed his coat and headed out. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to escape the suffocating emptiness. Anushka sat in her best friend Priya's cozy apartment, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The small space was cluttered with books and plants, a stark contrast to the pristine sterility of the house she had shared with Ivan. But here she felt at peace. "How are you holding up?" Priya asked, her eyes full of concern. "I'm fine," Anushka said, offering a small smile. "Better than I expected, actually. Work's been good and I feel like I can finally breathe." Priya nodded. "I'm proud of you, you know. It's not easy walking away from someone like Ivan." Anushka sighed. "I just wish I hadn't wasted so much time trying to fix something that was never meant to work. He never loved me, Priya. And I think I've finally accepted that." Before Priya could respond, Anushka's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Ivan's name. "What does he want now?" Priya muttered, narrowing her eyes. Anushka hesitated before picking up the phone. "Hello." "Anushka." Ivan's voice was softer than she remembered, almost hesitant. "What is it, Ivan?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. I just wanted to talk," he said. "I've been thinking about everything." "There's nothing left to talk about," she replied firmly. "I sent the papers, Ivan. Sign them and let's move on." There was a pause, and for a moment she thought he might have hung up. Then he spoke, his voice heavy with something she couldn't quite place. "I know I've been wrong. About you, about us. I didn't realize how much I took you for granted until you were gone." Anushka closed her eyes, willing herself to stay strong. "Ivan, it's too late. I spent 3 years waiting for you to see me, to love me. I won't waste any more time. Please," he said, his voice almost breaking. "Just give me a chance to make things right." Her grip on the phone tightened. Part of her wanted to laugh at the irony. After years of being ignored, he was finally paying attention. But she knew better. She had worked too hard to rebuild herself, to find her worth outside of him. "I can't, Ivan," she said quietly. "This isn't just about you. It's about me. And I deserve more than what you're offering." Before he could respond, she ended the call and placed the phone back on the table. Her hands were trembling, but her heart felt lighter. Priya reached over and squeezed her hand. "You did the right thing." Anushka nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. For the first time in years she felt in control of her life. Ivan's regret was his burden to bear, not hers. And as she sipped her tea, she allowed herself to imagine a future free from the weight of his indifference. Ivan stared at the phone in his hand, the dial tone humming in his ear. She had hung up on him. The finality of her words echoed in his mind. "I deserve more than what you're offering." It stung, but not as much as the realization that she was right. He had offered her nothing. No love, no warmth, no partnership. He had treated her like a convenience, a shadow in his life, and now she had stepped into the light without him. He set the phone down and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he sat on the couch. The silence of the house, once a refuge, now felt oppressive. He had always thought of himself as self-sufficient, a man who needed no one. But now, the void Anushka had left behind was unbearable. Anushka meanwhile was thriving. Her job at the marketing firm was challenging, but she relished the opportunity to prove herself. Every project, every deadline met, every small success was a step further from the timid, invisible woman she had been in her marriage. One evening as she wrapped up her work, her boss approached her desk. "Great job on the pitch today, Anushka," he said, handing her a folder. The client was impressed. "Keep this up and you'll have a promotion in no time." She smiled, pride swelling in her chest. "Thank you. I'm just glad to be contributing." As she left the office, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about the job, it was about reclaiming her identity, her purpose. Back at home, Ivan couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing more than just a wife. He was losing the chance to be a better man, a better partner. He thought about their wedding day, how she had looked at him with so much hope and love, and how he had ignored it, wallowing in his own grief and cynicism. He needed to see her. Not to convince her to come back. He knew now that it wasn't about winning her over. It was about closure, about taking responsibility for the pain he had caused. A week later, Anushka was at Priya's apartment, laughing over a glass of wine. Life felt lighter now, the burden of her marriage finally behind her. But her laughter faltered when there was a knock at the door. Priya opened it to reveal Ivan, looking disheveled and out of place in the cozy, welcoming space. "What are you doing here?" Priya asked sharply, blocking the doorway. "I need to talk to her," he said, his voice low but steady. Anushka stood and walked to the door, her arms crossed. "You've already said everything you needed to, Ivan. What more could you possibly want?" He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw something resembling vulnerability in his eyes. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Sorry for what?" "For everything," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "For not loving you the way you deserved. For taking you for granted. For being a coward." Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Ivan, I appreciate the apology, but it doesn't change anything. I've moved on. You should too. I know I can't undo the damage," he said. "But I needed you to know that it wasn't because of you. You're not the problem, I am. I was too caught up in my own pain to see you, to see what I had. And now it's too late." She studied him for a moment, her heart torn between the woman who had once loved him and the woman she had become. "You're right, Ivan. It is too late. But I'm glad you finally realized it. Maybe this will help you be better for someone else." He nodded, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "I hope so. I truly do." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing at the door. As she closed it, Priya gave her a questioning look. "Are you okay?" Anushka exhaled, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. "I think so. For the first time in a long time I feel free." And as Ivan disappeared into the night, Anushka knew she had made the right choice. This was her new beginning, one where she no longer settled for less than she deserved.